Okay, so hello everyone, and welcome to this tutorial about preprocessor directives in C. In this video, I will divide it into multiple parts, just so I can make it a lot easier for you to kind of navigate throughout the whole video. First, we will learn what preprocessor directives are, and then I will give some examples, and then the common mistakes that a lot of beginner programmers make, and then finally an activity that I prepared for you so that you can apply what you've learned in this video. So what are preprocessor directives? Preprocessor directives are basically instructions that are processed before the compilation actually begins. They use a hashtag symbol. They're responsible for adding macros, libraries, header files, and modules and all that stuff. First, let's look into include. We all know include. We all recognize this because this is the first ever piece of code that we actually write. But what even is it and what does it actually do? This basically tells the compiler to copy code from another file into your program before the compilation begins. For this, you can either use brackets or quotation marks. Brackets are system headers that are provided by the compiler, the one we're using right now. It stands for standard input and output. It basically has the basic read and write functions such as printf, scanf, but there are also other header files such as stdlib.h or string.h. Quotation marks, however, are used for user-defined headers. They're basically your own header files. Now let's take a look into define. Define is basically used to create macros. A macro is a code with a name that gets replaced by the preprocessor. Let's put it into practice. Let's say we have define Ohio 67. Now let's use the printf function. Let's say the number of residents in Ohio. Now that we have this, let's run the program. As you can see, it printed 67. That's because we called out our macro over here, which gets replaced by our value, which is 67. And that's basically what define is. It just replaces, you just make a macro and then the compiler replaces that macro with your given value, which is in my case 67. Now let's move on to if-def and end-if. These are basically used for conditional compilations. They allow the compiler to include or skip parts of code depending on where a macro is defined. If-def stands for if defined. This checks if a macro is defined. End-if tells the preprocessor to end the conditional block. It's used to close if-def. For example, let's say if-def Ohio and then printf this is a state, and then we close it with end-if. As you can see, it printed our output along with actually, let's remove this. There. As you can see, it printed our desired output. There's also one more thing, and that is undef. This basically stands for undefined, as it says in the name. What it does is it undefines our macro. However, if we use undefined after we use a macro, it's actually not going to undefine the macro right away. As you can see, wait, there we go. If we run this, it's still going to print our desired output. This is because we undefined our macro right after we use that said macro. So if I were to put our undefined here, it's not going to print our output. That's because we already undefined our macro before we actually try to use it over here. And that's basically it. Now, moving on to the common mistakes that beginner programmers make. The first mistake is mixing up quotation marks and brackets. For example, if we use quotation marks over here instead of brackets, it's actually still going to run. But the thing is, stdio.h is actually a system provided header, so you have to use brackets. So what happens is when you use quotation marks, what happens is that the compiler is going to look in your directory first. Now, why does this matter? Let's say, for example, that someone hypothetically made a file in your directory that is named stdio.h. What happens now is that the compiler will then use that file instead of looking in the system provided directory, which will cause massive confusion. So it's just highly recommended to know the differences of quotation marks and brackets. Another mistake is not putting parentheses when you're defining expressions in macros. So let's say over here we have a macro called Ohio with an expression of 6 plus 7. Now, we have a printf function. Basically what we want to happen is we want our compiler to first add these and then times it to 41. Let's try running this. As you can see, it printed 253, which is not our desired final answer. But if we were to add parentheses in our expression, as you can see, it printed our desired final answer, which is 533. This is because when you put parentheses, it actually already adds up 6 plus 7, so it becomes 41 times 13. If you don't, however, it just basically replaces the macro with literally 6 plus 7. So it's going to end up looking like this: 41 times 6 plus 7. What happens here is that it's going to first multiply 41 times 6 and then add it up to 7, which is going to result in 253. But if we add our parentheses, the value becomes 13 instead of literally 6 plus 7. So now what happens is it times 41 to 13, which results in 533. In conclusion, we covered how preprocessor directives work and used examples such as include, define, if-def, endif, and undef, as well as the common mistakes that beginner programmers make. Now, this is my activity for you. So what you're gonna do is you're gonna try and predict the output of this code right here. So basically what we have here is we have a macro called cat with a value of 10. So we're going to print the first output, which is there are 10 cats. Now this is my question. Will the compiler print this output right here? If you've already noticed, I undefined cat over here before we actually use the printf function. Now, is this still going to print output 2? That is your question. I highly encourage you to just copy this code. I'm gonna put it in the description so that you can just copy it easily and just paste it on your compiler. Just try to answer my question first. Is output 2 going to print? Yes or no? And once you have made your prediction, I want you to try and run this program to see what happens. If it actually prints this output or not. And that's basically it. If you found this tutorial helpful, please make sure to like, share, and comment. And also don't forget to subscribe. And that's all I have to say. See ya.